folks, how's it going? Realm Gaming here, back into the video. Today's episode, we're going to take a look at week 3 of the Mythic Plus meta, kind of how week 3 shaped up in terms of IO score between DPS, tank, and healer. And I'm going to do this video a little bit differently than my last one. I'm going to break this out between the 2 levels. So we have a high key levels, and then we have the 10 to 20 key levels. So what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to break this out between like the best pug friendly specs and the best pugs to push with as a group, because I honestly think 95% of the people watching this video are probably pugging keys. They're not playing in a coordinated group. So I want to try to make this video a little bit more geared towards that instead of just the highest end content that most of us aren't even going to be playing. So with that being said, let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to start out with high keys first, and then we'll jump into the 10 to 20 key range for the most pug friendly specs. So if you are pushing these high keys, you're probably looking in S and A tier, to be honest. Most people in the highest of keys, I'm not saying you can't do it, but you're probably not playing something in B to C tier. So let's just kind of focus on this area of the chart. The biggest movement that we did see from last week is going to be Balanced Druid up here at the top of S tier. They're sitting at the top of A tier last week, so really neat to see them make this huge move over Shadow Priest and both mage specs. This was something I said in my last video. I said, as the season goes on, we're going to see Balanced Druid move further and further up in the tier list. Just historically, that's kind of what's happened. Now, I will say this, it is kind of hard for Balance and Destro Lock right now. They're kind of competing for that third slot with Augmentation Evoker. The one thing that Destro Lock has going against it is it doesn't bring that class buff, right? So just kind of looking at this chart here, right? We got the Druid buff, we have the Power Infusion, we have Stamina buff, we have Intellect buff, and of course we have Augmentation Evoker if they want to swap that out for more defensive purposes, right? So Destro Lock is just competing with a whole bunch right now. I do think Destro Lock will eventually move up this chart. And I do think that Augmentation Evoker will eventually sort of start to fall off a little bit, but we'll just kind of see how that plays out as the season goes on. Going into A tier real quick, looks like Ellie Shaman's still holding strong in A tier. It's actually at the top of A tier, is at the bottom of A tier last week, so really cool to see this. We also have Rhett Pally at the top of A tier, no surprises there. We did see some movement here in Warrior. They were sitting in B tier last week. They're now in A tier. Then outside of that, no big surprises with anything else in here. Really, I do think Windwalker Monk moved up a little bit. I think Unholy DK moved up a little bit. But for the most part, everything in here has just kind of stayed within a position or two of its previous rankings. So biggest changes we saw was in Balanced Druid. We saw a pretty big leap here in Warriors as well. Then we just saw some small movement, right, from a few specs moving up into A tier. Now that's at the highest keys, right? Let's go ahead and move into the most pug-friendly specs. So I really agree with this graph, with Augmentation, of course, being S. And the reason it's so strong in pugs is because it's going to help your pug group survive the hard tyrannical bosses, the hard fortified trash. The most important thing in Mythic Plus is not the damage that you do necessarily. I mean, that is important. If that's not number 1, that's number 2. But I'd say number 1 is staying alive. And right now, with the damage profile being so high, with survivability being a huge check in all the dungeons, Augmentation Evoker is just kind of in a class of its own, in my opinion. And it looks like this Archon GG website kind of agrees with that, putting them in S tier. One thing that I am kind of surprised to see is Fire Mage so high. Typically you got to have a somewhat coordinated group to play around those combust windows. So pretty interesting to see them this high. I mean, Fire Mage might just be that strong right now. I'm not sure. I thought we would see something like Frost Mage a little bit higher than that. But regardless, both specs are performing really well. We also have Shadow Priest that's really strong. No surprises there. And then, of course, we have Balanced Druid and Destro Lock. You're only going to see that really good performance from Balanced Druid if you're pushing really high keys like we saw in the last graph. Just holistically looking at this table, you can kind of tell melee DPS are going to be sitting on the lower end of this graph. We do have a couple outliers here sitting high B, and then for the most part, range specs are going to be sitting higher up on the graph. Now, another thing, so this is the table. Take that as you will. Let's go down here and look at the DPS rankings. I think this is really interesting. So we can see the highest max key that we have here. We can see the top DPS, the top Mythic Plus score, kind of the popularity and number of parses here. So you can see right here at the top, right? if you're bringing an Augmentation Evoker, you're doing a lot less DPS. Now, is that DPS being reflected into some of these other specs? Sure, but overall, you do bring less damage when you bring an Augmentation Evoker, even factoring that in. But with that being said, regardless, Augmentation Evoker is just insane right now, in my opinion. Most of the keys that I've personally failed, it's not because DPS wasn't there. It's because it's a heal check or it's a survivability issue. Somebody's not pressing a defensive. Augmentation Evoker, especially in pug groups, is going to really clean up a lot of those misplays. Let's say you have a DPS not using a health stone, not using health pots, not using defenses when they're supposed to be. Augmentation Evoker is going to clean a lot of that mess up. That's why I love to run with them, especially this season. Now, in the mage department, you can see Fire Mage is actually rated higher than Frost Mage, even though it does less damage. Now, I'm not necessarily sure why that is. I'm not a Frost Mage pro or anything. I have no clue. Maybe in the comments, somebody could give us some information on that, because the popularity is higher for Frost Mage. The damage is higher for Frost Mage. So Fire Mage brings something that Frost Mage isn't. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it's some sort of survivability. Maybe it's some sort of priority damage. Not really sure. But regardless, they're pretty close. I mean, they're within 7 points. But you would think Frost Mage would be higher, considering it's more popular spec and its damage is higher. I guess one other small outlier here. Let's just quickly go through the graph. See down here, we have Demo Lock performing very well. We have Marksmanship Hunter performing very well. I can tell you why these two are low. Demo Lock is low because Destruction Warlock exists. And then Marksmanship Hunter is low, probably because survivability. So it's interesting to kind of scroll through this graph and see, some of these specs do really good damage. There's just something else going on there that might keep them from being higher in the tier list. I do also think Unholy DK will eventually creep up as the season goes on. You can see it's performing pretty well right now. I would say it looks like it's the highest of the melee DPS specs, even higher than Rep Pally, which is pretty crazy. One thing that's really interesting, right, is we have Rep Pally at nearly a 20% representation among DPS specs. And this is surprising too. Shadow Priest had a 15% representation along DPS specs. So really cool to see that. I wish Augmentation Evoker is a little bit higher just because they're so strong right now. And this just goes to show you like some of the glaring issues with specific specs, like Arcane Mage sitting at 0.6%, Frost DK 0.4%, Assassin Rogue, Feral Druid, Affliction Warlock, Sub Rogue. Just kind of interesting to see overall, I guess. But yeah, with that being said, go ahead and pause the video if you want. This is the most pug-friendly specs at the moment. Let's go ahead and jump into tank, and let's go into high keys first. So looking at tank, we got Havoc Demon Hunter still holding strong in S tier, looking at over 200 IO gap between the next A tier. We have Prot Pally and then Guardian Druid in A tier, Prot Warrior in B. And then this is kind of interesting. We did see Blood DK fall down into the bottom of C tier. Last week, Blood DK was sitting up here with Prot Pally, and they're both sitting in B tier actually. So the way this looked last week is we had Blood DK and Prot Pally in B tier. We had Demon Hunter at the top of S tier, and then everything else was C tier. So there's actually nothing in A tier. So the gap was that big between Demon Hunter and the second best tank. And to be honest, I know these say A tier, but the gap still is that big. It's 200 IO score between the best and the second best tank. So I know Demon Hunter did get nerfed a little bit. Looks like those nerfs didn't do a whole bunch to the spec. It's still performing just as strong. But yeah, this is very surprising to see Blood DK this low. I'm not sure exactly what happened. I thought maybe it had something to do with the DPS department. I don't know, maybe it could be some sort of mitigation issue. Not 100% sure there. I will say I have run with a few Blood DKs healing them. And these two tanks feel the squishiest by far. I mean, their health bars just go from 100 to like 5%. And I think it's kind of hard to play Blood DK in Brewmaster right now. You have to really be on your toes, and you have to mitigate the damage through healing. And that's a lot of the times harder to do than just passive mitigation. Requires a higher reaction time, and it's just harder to play around, in my opinion. So maybe that's why we're seeing them so low. I don't think they're weak by any means, neither one of these two specs, but they do feel squishier than everything up here. I have healed a Guardian Druid. I have healed a Prot Pally. I have healed a Havoc Demon Hunter. Excuse me, a Vengeance Demon Hunter. They all feel really good, really tanky. No issues there. I was healing my buddy the other night in a 10 Brackenhide Tyrannical. He was 480 eye level. He tanked it just fine. I mean, there were a few encounters that were a little spiky, but I mean, he was 30 eye level below where he needed to be for a 10 key. So all things considered, it went really well. And it didn't feel insanely crazy to heal him up. So, Prot Pally's feeling really good. Guardian Druid's feeling really good. Everything in SNA's feeling good. I have no clue on Prot Warrior. I haven't healed one this season. I might have healed one, but I don't remember exactly how it went. So I guess they're just kind of sitting in the average department right now. I will say another thing that's really interesting, if you look at DPS, so Vengeance Demon Hunter, Blood DK, and Brew Mastery are the 3 highest DPS tank specs. So I'd say what's going on here is some sort of like mitigation issue with these two. And then Vengeance Demon Hunter just brings so much utility, damage, mitigation. That's kind of why there's such a large gap between these two. It does seem that Prot Pally might be lacking in the damage department a little bit. But of course, what they lack in damage, they bring in group utility and survivability. So it seems not to be affecting them too much. So that's high keys. Let's look at the pug-friendly tanks. So in terms of pug friendliness, tanks are all performing pretty well. I mean, they're all very close to each other. Of course, we still got the huge gap between S and A tier. And the graph looks very similar to the high keys. You do see Prot Warrior moving into A tier to high A tier. So it's actually the second best pug-friendly tank at the moment. But, looking at IO score here, I mean, you're only looking at a 23 IO score difference. All these tanks are pretty much performing at a similar level if you're just pugging keys. All right, moving over to the healers really quick. We do have Resto Druid sitting high S tier. No surprises there. Looking at over a 200 IO score gap between Resto Druid and Mistweaver Monk. We actually did see a little bit of movement for Holy Priest. So they're sitting high A tier last week, and now they're bottom A tier. Not saying they're bad or anything, but there was some movement there. So last week, this graph went Resto Druid, Mistweaver Monk, Holy Priest, then Resto Shaman. So we kind of saw these two positions almost swap. But not only did we see these two specs swap, we also saw Holy Pally move from the lowest tier healer to second lowest by 1 IO, it looks like. Now, to be honest with you, this is pretty crazy balance if you ask me. I mean, we have 5 healers here within 5 IO score of each other. I mean, you couldn't really ask for anything better than that. There's a very small outlier here with Mistweaver Monk. If you look at the HPS department, Mistweaver Monk is performing the highest, and I think that's one of the reasons they're so high on this list. We don't bring the utility that something like a Resto Shaman might bring or Resto Druid might bring, but the fact that they're able to heal so much, I guess, is what's bringing them to the high end of this table here. And to be completely honest with you, looking at this table here, I'm really surprised to see Mistweaver Monk healing this much in comparison to Resto Druid. I thought the reason that these two were so high in the graph is because their HPS was just so much higher than everything else. But the fact that Mistweaver Monk is healing more than Resto Druid right now is super surprising to me. The only thing that I can think of that brings Resto Druid above Mistweaver Monk is the versatility buff that they bring, Mark of the Wild. It's going to give them more survivability, more damage. They probably don't have to heal as much because they bring more group utility, and they're able to mitigate that damage through buffs and whatnot. Now, to be honest, I did think Holy Pally would be down here in C tier again. So really glad to see them up here in A tier with some of the other healers, especially on the high end of keys. I thought, in terms of pugging, that Holy Pally would probably be in a graph similar to this. But the fact that this is high end keys, Holy Pally is able to perform with some of these other specs. So really happy to see that. Then let's quickly go ahead and look at the most pug friendly healers. So pretty similar list to what we're seeing before, right? We have Resto Druid in S tier, everything else here in A tier. A little bit of small movement here, but nothing major. So in terms of healers, if you're not playing Resto Druid, if you're not playing the highest end of keys, pretty much just play what you want. Nothing is bad right now, which is pretty rare to see. You typically have at least one healer down here in B or C tier, so really good to see everything in A tier. Even if Resto Druid is performing this much better than the other healers, I don't think it's necessarily due to them healing more or doing more damage. I think it's just the utility department, to be honest. I will say this, I do think there could be a slight bump still in Holy Paladin. Uh, Looks like Resto Shaman needs a small bump. I think probably the average here is going to be like 140 is kind of where you want to be sitting at, or high 130s. So I do think that Resto Shaman and Holy Pally do need a small bump in the healing department. You know, I think it's really interesting to see is Holy Pally's damage here. 20k below Resto Shaman, which is the next lowest on the list. It's not the next lowest. I guess technically it's Mistweaver Muck, but still, I mean, that's a huge difference. That's almost a 20% gap, right? So you can see, you know, just kind of sorting by the graph here, you can see Holy Pally, the lowest HPS and the lowest damage healer at the moment. Now, on the flip side of that, we do have Holy Priest on the high end of the spectrum, almost overperforming by 20k DPS. So in the healing department, I do think there's a little bit of fine tuning that still needs to be taken here. All right, guys, that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. We'll see you on the next one.